Hey everyone, this is writing micro lesson number 8 on writing effective conclusions for Honors 112 in the Civilization sequence of the Honors College at the University of Maine. And I'm Rob Glover, the instructor. So today we're going to talk about conclusions. Sometimes we treat conclusions kind of like an afterthought, and we don't dedicate the time and attention that we need to conclusions. But hopefully by the end of this short lesson, you'll have a sense of why conclusions are really important, and we should really treat them as seriously as anything we would within the context of our writing. So we'll talk about why conclusions are important, some things to avoid, some things to really be attentive to, and then we'll look at some general guidelines and an example of what I think is a pretty good conclusion. So why are conclusions important? First off, they're your last word. And so just in the same way that the thesis statement and the introduction is really important because it sets the stage for your writing, the conclusion is what is going to be memorable for your reader. It's where you lay out the significance of what you've written. Perhaps there's some sort of call to action. You're telling your reader that they ought to do something. And it's the last thing that they read. It's the thing that sticks with them when they're thinking back on your writing. So it's really important. It's your final opportunity to communicate to your reader. It's also an opportunity for synthesis, which is not just summary. It's not just restating the intellectual path that you've taken, but also pulling together ideas, taking all these different main ideas and points that you've made and really trying to kind of create some sort of continuity between them. And it's also an area where you have a lot of freedom in relation to the rest of the essay. Some of the other elements, particularly of an argumentative essay, can be somewhat formulaic. You're laying out a main idea, then supporting it with evidence. But conclusions are an area in which you can be really creative, and you can use language and examples and personal stories even to talk about why something is significant and important. So conclusions are not an afterthought. It is not a formulaic next step so that you can be done writing. It is something that the best writers take really seriously. So how can we be more intentional then, if this is so important? How can we be more intentional in crafting our conclusions? Let me start off with some things to avoid. The first thing that I would say, and I see this in students writing, I see this in the writing of my faculty colleagues, it's a pretty common construction. But something like in conclusion or to conclude, you don't need that for writing, right? The writer knows when you're wrapping up. Where you see in conclusion, where it is important, is when you're giving a speech, you're presenting an argument in the context of a debate. The listener does not know when you are almost done with your point. And in conclusion, in that context, can be a signal to say, hey, I'm about to finish up and I'm about to synthesize the really key arguments that I've made, so you should listen. But the reader doesn't need that. Right. And so it seems kind of amateurish when you see it in writing, and you can just avoid it. It's unnecessary. You also want to avoid just repeating or summarizing what's in your introduction. So your reader has already read your introduction. They've read your entire piece, and it's kind of an anticlimactic way to end your writing when you simply say, I did this, I did this, I did this, and now it's over. So try to be more creative than that. It's certainly, it's one way to end a piece of writing, but it's not the best way. You also want to avoid apologizing for or qualifying your viewpoint. So if you've made an argument, if you've defended a claim, sometimes what you see in the conclusion is you start to think about all the ways in which your evidence was weak or shaky, or there are these other viewpoints that might come into play that contradict your own viewpoint. And you don't want to do that, right? You don't want to apologize for or qualify your viewpoint. You want to address counter arguments as they arise, and that will make your writing stronger. But in the conclusion, you want to be forcefully restating your viewpoint or your claim and not leaving the reader with thinking about all the ways in which it might not be, there might be ways to challenge it. You also don't want to introduce an entirely new question, idea, or subtopic that's not related to your thesis statement. So if there is something that is beyond the scope of your paper or your piece of writing, it is beyond the scope of your paper or piece of writing. And the conclusion generally does not introduce some new idea that you then cannot support and can't really articulate or contextualize. And you also, and I do see this particularly late in the semester when people are tired and they're run down, where you write a final paragraph and it's kind of, that's just, you've reached the limit or the expected page requirement, and you say, okay, good enough, and it's over. And it doesn't make any attempt to talk about any sort of larger significance. It doesn't make any attempt to synthesize. That is really evident to your reader. Like when I read things and they just kind of end, it seems abrupt, and it seems as if the writer has just given up. So you don't want to do that either, right? You want to be intentional about a conclusion that is designed as a conclusion. So that's what to avoid. What should you strive for? There's some different things that you can do in your conclusion, and that's why I talk about this as an area in which you have relative freedom as a writer. So one thing that you can do, and often should try to do, is answer the so what question. So your reader at the end of your piece might be saying, okay, that was interesting, and I buy the argument, and I think it's well supported, but why is this relevant? Why does this matter? And the conclusion is your opportunity to say, yes, I am talking about this very specific point, but there are larger implications that we need to take into account. You should also try to link your conclusion to your thesis statement. So the intellectual destination that you've laid out at the beginning of your paper, it should link up with your conclusion. If you're in a radically different place talking about something completely different by the end of your paper, then something has gone wrong. So the conclusion should in some way follow from the thesis statement, the main claim or argument that you laid out at the beginning of the paper. And this is also an opportunity to synthesize the points provided in the body of the essay. This is an area, as I said, in which you have freedom, so you can utilize provocative questions, quotes, anecdotes. You can reference earlier ones. Sometimes a good kind of device in your writing is to introduce a character personally affected by something at the outset, and then kind of go into the body of your paper and return back to that individual character. So there's a story that weaves its way through your writing. You have a lot of freedom here, and I encourage you to experiment and do what works for you. But the best writers are thinking very intentionally about ways in which to end their writing that leaves something with the reader, right? That kind of rattles around in your brain even after you've walked away from it. And one of the ways that they do that is utilizing conclusions. You can also use the conclusion to evoke a vivid image or provide a warning. So if you're writing, for instance, about the ways in which policymakers are disregarding the threat of climate change. So you've made an argument that this isn't being taken seriously, and then the conclusion could be laying out the potential costs, the implications of ignoring this issue or not doing enough to address it, right? And the vivid image that you leave your reader with, the thing that rattles around in their head, is the costs, the long-term implications of not taking steps that are the natural next steps from your arguments. You can also universalize or generalize in your conclusion. So you have probably been focused pretty specifically on one thing, one example, but you can say, okay, this is an interesting example, but it is indicative of these larger trends in societies, in human beings, in the world in which we live. And it's not just about this one case, it's about something that has a much broader set of implications. So those are some examples of specific strategies and specific things to strive for within your conclusion. So what are the general guidelines then for effective conclusions? When I break it down to just general advice for the conclusion, and these are the criteria that I'll be using to grade your essays for this week, I want to see three things, basically. One is continuity. So it has to link up with the thesis statement and the body of the essay. If it jumps off in some other direction, then you just leave your reader confused. You leave them feeling as if they didn't understand something about the basic guidelines of what you had laid out, what you had set out to do. So it needs to follow naturally from what is in your paper. But it also needs to, and this is the second point, provide value added. This is a term that comes from economics. When you take a product and you innovate in some way, or you create some new function, some new use, some new aesthetic value, they call that value added. But it applies to our writing as well. So it shouldn't just be a summary. It has to go a step further than summarizing what you've done. And it can generalize, it can warn your reader about some pressing problem or issue, and it can offer a call to action. It might even provide concrete steps that readers could take to avoid some future problem, right? Or something that they should be thinking about that perhaps they're not. And the third point is it should be vivid and engaging. There's a lot of different ways to do this. And I gave you some examples in the last slide. But it somehow needs to try to evoke something powerful in your reader. It's not simply a restatement of what you've done in the essay, but it tries to, really kind of leave them with some food for thought so that the writing, the argument that you're making continues to influence them even after they've stepped away from it, that it's something memorable that they continue to think about. So I'm going to give you an example of what I think is a really good conclusion. This is a recent article that was about motherhood and the challenges of motherhood and why many mothers are super self-critical about their role as mothers, right? And so the title is there. It's from Time Magazine. It's a journalistic piece. And it says, "Motherhood is hard to get wrong, so why do so many moms feel so bad about themselves?" And this is the conclusion. I'll just read it and then talk about it a little bit. The author writes, "Motherhood in the connected era doesn't have to be dominated by any myth. Social media can just as easily help celebrate our individual experience and create community through contrast. Moms have to stick together even as we walk our separate paths. We have to spot the templates and realize that there are no templates. We have to talk about our failures and realize that there are no failures." I stared at this for a while and was trying to think about why I like it so much as a conclusion. There's a couple of things I would note here. So this article, the full article, is really about how social media is a tool that we should use to communicate with one another and kind of let others in on the totality of our experience, right? And understand each other better. And what she was arguing is that in reality, what you get in social media is it's a very curated, very selective presentation of our reality. And so particularly with motherhood, mothers are looking at the examples provided by other mothers on social media, and they're only seeing the elements that those mothers are proud of, right? And it creates this unrealistic set of expectations for what it means to be a good mother. And you could apply this to lots of other settings as well, right? A good relationship, what it means to be a popular person, what it means to be happy or funny or well-adjusted. Social media presents a very selective picture of that. With motherhood, it creates an unrealistic set of expectations. And so a lot of her article was laying out the ways in which we have to be honest about our failures. We have to not judge other mothers according to this set of unrealistic expectations. So this conclusion links in really interesting ways to the broader argument that's made and is well supported within the article. So there's continuity there. It's also it's very interesting in that the language is really good, right? We have to spot the templates and realize that there are no templates. We have to talk about our failures and realize that there are no failures. There's just something aesthetically pleasing about that. It's a really artful way of presenting a pretty straightforward point. And it also provides the reader with some value added, right? They're going to be thinking as they go off and use social media about the ways that they signal out into the world and project into the world an unrealistic set of expectations that could harm others, but also harm themselves, right? They're setting themselves up for an unrealistic set of expectations that will inevitably make them feel bad about themselves. So that stuck with me after I read this piece. I read it and then I carried it around in my head for a few days and said, yeah, I do this all the time. I project out a very selective version of myself. And part of that is about self-protection, but it's also creating unrealistic expectations for who I am as a person and who others ought to be. So I really like it. I think it's well done. It's concise. It is continuous with the rest of the article. And it is, it presents the reader with an idea that they're going to take away, something that's really vivid that they're going to continue to think about. So obviously not every piece that you write, particularly for the civilization sequence, is going to have a clear application to something in the present day, but you want to try to do that as much as you can, even if it's not something immediately linked to our present experience. You want to leave your reader with something that's going to bounce around in their head a little bit. And even if they don't remember the specific point that you made or the specific textual reference that you made, the larger argument that the author presents in the conclusion sticks with them. So think about that in your own writing. And this is a process of trial and error. You'll try to do things and it will work well or it won't work. But just try things out. Be experimental with your conclusions and try to not follow the simple formula of restating to your reader what you've done in the context of the piece. There's lots of really good guidance on the internet for how to do this. The UNC Writing Center has a set of tips and tools for effective conclusions. Some of the what to do and what not to do was drawn from that website. And also the University of Richmond's Writing Center has a good guide for how to structure conclusions. So for your writing for this week, I want you to think intentionally about your conclusion. And as I said, these are going to be the guidelines that I'll be using to grade it through the rubric. I want to see continuity, I want to see value added, and I want you to try to be vivid and engaging in your conclusion. And that's going to do it for this micro lesson on conclusions. So I look forward to reading what you write for this week. Thanks very much.